So is Hobbes' state of nature argument realistic and does it matter? Is Hobbes' state of nature argument realistic and does it matter? Well, again, like I think that there are some formulations of the questions in the University of London which are kind of idiosyncratic and problematic. Like this formulation on Rousseau, for example, right? This phrase that they use is Rousseau a defender or a critic of the social contract tradition? That's a very complicated question, complicated to interpret. The University of London, in their official commentaries, they interpret this as a question about the second discourse. But so I'm talking about Rousseau now, right? But just as easily, this could be interpreted as a question about the social contract, or you could devote approximately equal time to both social contract and the discourse. And I think this is a valid strategy. The University of London stresses over and over and over again that the exam commentary should not be taken to be like the single definitive answer. And as long as you argue your case, basically anything goes. If you show your understanding and your mastery of the subject, if you if there could be alternative interpretations. And I have to stress this, especially those of you who are going to be reading exam commentaries carefully, that there's a big difference between things that were happening in the previous years and this year. Because in the previous years, if you wrote 2 questions on Rousseau, and let's say you took this question and wrote about both the second discourse and the social contract, it means that the other question, which was presumably about the social contract, you would have to repeat stuff you already said. And the University of London, in the exam comments, they explicitly advise against that. They say, if you repeat portions of your answer, you will be penalized. Again, this was in the previous years where you could answer 2 questions on the same thinker. This year, the situation has changed, so I think this is an invitation. So I'm coming from afar, right? Let me get closer to Hobbes. So likewise, so in Hobbes, there are some formulations which are kind of, I think, problematic, like the one about sovereignty by institution and acquisition. It sounds kind of like it takes a certain effort to interpret it in the right way. Or let's say this question: critically assess Hobbes' social contract theory. So even though it says critically assess Hobbes' social contract theory, they actually expect you. It seems that they expect you to talk mostly about the state of nature. Again, there are different ways to interpret the question, different legitimate ways to interpret the question, but the default option that the University of London picks is for you to talk about the state of nature. So when we get to the question that we had on the exam, so in the context of everything I said before, is again, is Hobbes' state of nature argument realistic and does it matter? This, I think, is a deeply straightforward question. This is simply a question about the state of nature. So this question is more or less identical in its formulation to the question: critically assess Hobbes' account of the state of nature. Critically assess Hobbes' account of the state of nature, and probably because of that, I'm not sure how far I need to go talking about it. So, well, I don't know, like. Even if the question did not specify it, even if the question was simply critically assess Hobbes' account of the state of nature, you had to along the way, as you are answering the question, you definitely had to talk about this. Is the state of nature argument realistic, and does it matter, right? So talking about whether Hobbes' state of nature argument is realistic, like any answer on Hobbes, should mention this by way of criticisms, sort of by way of criticism, right? Some kind of a discussion of whether people are actually as Hobbes describes them, right? Is it true? Is Hobbes giving a realistic description of the human beings? You can have different assumptions about human nature. I mean, John Locke, for example, has a totally different assumptions about human nature in the sense that human beings are mostly rational and human beings are mostly aware of the law of nature and will naturally understand and will naturally at least tend to exercise, like, right, the law of nature. So when we talk about Hobbes' assumptions being unrealistic, I suppose the most important name to keep in mind is C.B. Macpherson. So Macpherson, who says that Hobbes is not describing human nature as it exists universally, but he's only talking about certain effects, right, of capitalist society, of early capitalist society on human nature. And basically what Macpherson is trying to allude to is that Macpherson, being a Marxist, imagines that in communism, when the conditions are going to be different, you're not going to see the same kind of human nature, right? So this is one part of the question, and obviously there's more to say about that. But let's just have this on the table. Is Hobbes' argument realistic? Again, and Like, and at the end of the day, I don't think it does, I don't think it matters. I think it doesn't matter what kind of question you have on Hobbes. The question could be on the state of nature, or the question could be on absolute sovereignty. Still, your critical discussion should include at least one sentence about whether people in real life are actually as Hobbes describes them, right? It's a very important part of your answer, or in general of analyzing Hobbes or critically assessing Hobbes. This is point number one. And point number two, it's an interesting question, like, does it matter? Does Hobbes' account of the state of nature matter? And there are ways to interpret this. And in some sense, I'm kind of, I'm not sure if I want to give away the answer, because it would be more interesting for me to ask you how you interpret this question, right? And maybe we can do this in the seminar or in the office hours. But again, in the interest of saving time, I think one plausible interpretation of this part is to say that, look, Hobbes' state of nature is something like a thought experiment. Nobody ever finds themselves in these horrible conditions of war against all. Like, even during the French Revolution or even during the Russian Revolution, in the breakdown of authority, there was some measure of order and stability, and there was some measure of communication between people, and like between the Reds and the Whites, and there was some kind of police forces or whatever. Like, there was some measure of order. It's not complete chaos the way Hobbes describes it. But you could say that so you could say, yes, Hobbes' account is unrealistic, but it doesn't matter whether it's realistic or not, because Hobbes, let's say, captures a certain tendency, right? And like the thought experiment is enough to is sufficient for his conclusions, right? Or you could say that, especially like if you talk about how it's unrealistic, you could say that sort of if we imagine earliest times of human history, or if we imagine the first mover problem, we could say Hobbes' account is unrealistic, but it doesn't matter, because still, as an ideal type, it captures something about reality. So there are important elements in Hobbes' account of the state of nature which are unrealistic, but still it is valid and applicable today. Something along those lines. Again, we could have a broader discussion of this issue. I just wanted to highlight some points. I don't want to spend too much time on this right now. Partly because it doesn't just pertain to this question, to this particular question, but any question on Hobbes invites critical discussion. And any question on Hobbes, sort of, I mean, you shouldn't expect a full answer from me right now, because we're gonna spend the next month basically improving on our answer. But these are just some points to keep in mind. Okay. Yeah. So okay, let me address a couple questions from the chat. So can you say that the state of nature is not real? Well, again, you have to be careful, because again, the answer to every question on the University of London is yes and no, and it's complicated. So Hobbes is going to say that the state of nature has a certain kind of reality, but it's like, again, in some sense, his deep point about the state of nature, his picture of the state of nature is that when you go to sleep at night, you are not sure that you're going to wake up in the morning. And you could say that conditions in civil war, or conditions when there's a breakdown of civil authority or international relations, right? You could say that they approximate the state of nature, but it seems that they are never or very rarely as drastic as Hobbes depicts them. So I would say that, like, you shouldn't just straight come out and say, oh, Hobbes' state of nature is not real. This is a strong claim. Okay, don't make this kind of claim. But at the same time, there is a certain problem in Hobbes. There's a certain like nuance. Does he actually mean the state of nature as this something really that exists outside the window? Some theorists interpret Hobbes as only talking about the state of nature hypothetically, as a thought experiment. So, like, the short answer is you should be aware of both interpretations. So one interpretation is state of nature is real. The other one, no, it's just a thought experiment. Okay, just be aware of both interpretations and probably mention both interpretations, and then you can make your own decisions. So also let's talk about Taylor Warrender for 5 seconds. So let me look at the question again. So is Hobbes' state of nature realistic? Kind of state of nature realistic, and does it matter? So obviously, if you talk about the state of nature, Taylor Warrender are kind of in the picture. So like any when you talk about absolute sovereignty, I think there's less reasons to include Taylor Warrender, but especially when you talk about the state of nature, I think Taylor Warrender are really important and pertinent in general. Because Taylor and Warrender, like in a nutshell, again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but in a nutshell, Taylor and Warrender address an essential feature of the state of nature, right? So you could ask, in the state of nature, how do people behave? What governs their behavior? And the standard interpretation is that there is no morality in the state of nature and everything is chaotic. But Taylor and Warrender are going to say, no, there is the law of nature, and everybody knows the law of nature in the state of nature. And at least in foro internal, they try to, so in foro internal, in their conscience, sorry, in their conscience, at least, people recognize that there's a state of nature, and they at least hope or want to obey the law of nature. And this does make the state of nature less chaotic. This is if you want a Lockean interpretation of Hobbes. So again, to answer Sophia's question directly, no, I think that again, Taylor and Warrender are deeply important in this question. That's the basic idea. I want to at least try to get started on Taylor, Warrender, and Hampton. And again, obviously, for people who are struggling, it's better to concentrate on more basic literature, like study guide or maybe even voucher, and not sort of go off the deep end into Taylor, Warrender, and Hampton. But still, like if you can, it is a good idea to take a look at those things. So so if we open the files, so let me change my screen share to that. So let's start with Hampton. So Hampton has a book, and well, it's actually probably not a very good idea to start with Hampton, because in some sense, so it is a more difficult of the two, but still. So I hope you can see. So this is Hampton's book. It's called Hobbes and the Social Contract Tradition. So and maybe we can go back to the table of contents. So there's a bunch of chapters here, and some of the chapters. So to a large extent, what Hampton is doing is she is simply retelling Hobbes's book in hopefully what she thinks is a more coherent fashion. So by all means, if you have the time or the inclination, it's not a bad idea to try to read through all of this. So she begins with his assumptions. She has the discussion of the state of nature, the reasons for conflict, and I think she does somewhere along the lines. I think she does present the game's theoretical approaches actually. So she talks about this absolute sovereignty, authorizing the sovereign, authorization, social contract, and so I want you to be aware of the fact that sort of all of this is here, but the most important parts I was just looking for the games theory tables. I think she has the games theory tables. Yeah. So folks, yeah. So so when she talks about the state of nature, she actually has these things which are in games theory called payoff matrices. Payoff matrices. So maybe it's a good idea to look at that. But I think that the most important chapters are the ones that deal with problems, because when we talk about Hampton, we're mostly looking for her criticisms. So when she talks about the social contract, she has this line here. She has problems with the social contract, but then even more importantly, she talks about this failure of Hobbes's social contract argument. So again, well, maybe so I would imagine that chapter 6 and chapter 7 are the ones that you should focus on, and chapter 7 being more important of the two. So again, I don't necessarily want to go through all of this in great detail, but sort of just sort of to be on the same side, on the same page. So again, so the failure of social contract argument. So she starts with the quote. So while Mr. Hobbes, with one hand, speciously offers up to kings and monarchs the royal gifts and privileges, he, with the other, treacherously plunges a dagger into their very hearts. So basically, from the very beginning, people were aware that there's this rebellious element in Hobbes. And I think it's a good idea to read through all of this. but then especially okay, like in some sense, the gist of Hampton's argument is again this phrase: would Hobbesian people in the state of nature desire to institute a sovereign? Would they authorize? And she talks about how would people sort of on the wards themselves, would they be obliged to obey the sovereign's every command? And then very importantly, yeah, there's this chapter 7.2 says Leviathan shown to be a rebel's catechism. Leviathan shown to be a rebel's catechism. So I think all of this is very important. And again, the gist of Hampton's argument, although we need to double check it and read through all this, hopefully it's going to be useful in more ways than one. The basic idea of Hampton's argument is that because the contract is void if I am not protected, because of this, sovereignty can never be absolute. And in fact, she gives these 5 points, and these are the summary of Hampton's argument. In some sense, the centerpiece. So if you read nothing else, you definitely should read this. So she says something like this, right? So in order for peace to be secured, an absolute sovereign must be created. An absolute sovereign is defined as one who is master of all his subject slaves. This absolute sovereign is the final decider of all questions in the Commonwealth, including the questions whether or not he will continue to hold power, and in virtue of deciding the last question, he holds power permanently. Hobbesian people empower a ruler by obeying his punishment commands, and they do so whenever they decide such obedience is conducive to the best interest. But from point number 2, it follows that the ruler created by Hobbesian people does not decide all questions. In particular, he does not decide for his subjects the question whether or not they will obey his commands, including the punishment command. So again, so maybe the contract is void, and I have to decide whether the contract is void or not. So it seems that the ruler does not decide all questions. At least one question of whether the contract is void or not is decided by the people, and this supposedly gives too much power to the people. It follows from point 3 that insofar as a ruler holds power only as long as his subjects obey the punishment commands, the subject determine by the decision whether or not to obey these commands, whether or not he will continue to hold power. Hence, from 3 and 4, Hobbesian people cannot create a ruler who meets the definition of sovereign in point 1, i.e. a ruler who decides the question of the Commonwealth, which from point 1 means that they cannot secure peace. So basically what Hampton is saying is that, and maybe let me repost this into the chat. So Hampton is saying, so this is Hampton page, oops, sorry. This is Hampton page 206. Hampton's argument is that basically Hobbes is caught in a contradiction, because Hobbes says that in order to secure peace, sovereignty has to be absolute. However, the way that Hobbes sets up absolute sovereignty, it is clear that you cannot have absolute sovereignty, right? That sovereignty will be necessarily limited by the decision of the subjects. So in some sense, Hampton is saying that if the situation is as Hobbes describes it, you end up in a catch-22 situation. You end up in a blind alley. That in some sense, people are doomed to simply forever be stuck in the state of nature, if we believe Hobbes' account. And basically, what Hampton, I think, what she's driving at, is that Hobbes is simply wrong. He describes people as way too chaotic. He describes the state of nature as way too chaotic, and human nature as way too chaotic. In fact, human nature is not as chaotic as Hobbes describes it, and that's why we can have society. That's I think, the basic gist of Hampton's argument. Apologies, if I could, for 1 second. Hang on. Yeah, technical issues, slight technical issues. Okay, so this is the basics of Hampton's argument. But for people doing Hampton for Friday, I hope that you'll be able to, expand on this issue, and maybe also comment on the distinction between Gautier and Hampton. But that's basically what I wanted to say. Any questions about Hampton right now? Again, as always, feel free to use the chat. Okay, so I don't imagine that we have covered Hampton, but at least uh, at least I said a couple words. So let me move on to Taylor, I think. And again, there's a bunch of other philosophers like Macpherson and Plamenius and others, and we need to be able to say at least a couple of words about all of them as well. But I wanted to focus on these guys starting today. Maybe I'll say a couple of words about Macpherson if we have time. So yeah, so this is an article written in 1938, so a very long time ago actually, by Taylor, whose name I think I was unable to find, only the initials, A.E. Taylor, and sort of, so it's a fairly short article. It's less than 20 pages, and I think if we try to understand this article, we need to focus on his comparison with Kant. So let me again just look at a couple of sentences. So yeah. Okay, so the man is to be accounted just who does just things because the law commands it, unjust things only by the reason of his infirmity. And this is a quote from Hobbes. He's properly said to be unjust when, who does righteousness for fear of punishment and unrighteousness by reason of the iniquity of his mind. This is precisely, says Taylor, this is precisely Kant's distinction between actions done merely in accordance with the law and actions done from the law, with the characteristic difference that Hobbes is trying to reduce the law from which the virtuous man acts to the single law that a promise, once duty fulfilled, must be kept. That the promise, once duly fulfilled, must be kept. And Hobbes is laying himself open to the very same line of argument, which has fairly or unfairly been used against Kant at a good will, which wills nothing but this conformity to the law, because law is formal and empty. Okay, so let me go back to the quote. So this is a quote from I think it's from the Chive, or no? It's a good question. Yes. This comes out particularly striking in the passage in the Chive, where Hobbes is explaining the difference between the justice of an act and justice of a person. So Hobbes, so again, we have to be careful. So because Taylor is relying not on the Leviathan, but on the Chiva. And what Taylor is saying is the sort of the passage that he's drawing our attention to. It sounds actually very un-Hobbesian, because what the passage is saying is, apologies, if can I copy this? Doesn't seem to work very well. That's strange. I'm trying to copy. This is Taylor, page 408, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So this sounds like a very un-Hobbesian quote, because Hobbes, although again we have to be careful, this is from the Chiva. Hobbes seemed to say that a person who does the right thing only out of fear of punishment is actually not being moral, is not, properly speaking, being just. This sounds strange again, and sounds very un-Hobbesian, because we are we're accustomed to talking about Hobbes as this great amoralist who only cares about what sort of phrase, punishments and those kinds of things. And it's like, and isn't this the Hobbes who says that in the state of nature, force and fraud are two cardinal virtues, and now he's somehow saying that sort of no, that justice, properly speaking, is an action done merely in this quasi-Kantian fashion out of respect for the law. Unrighteousness by the reason of Unfortunately, I cannot copy this properly. Okay, this quotation is broken. I'm sorry. This file is broken. Anyway, but you can look in the text. So this is what Taylor focuses on. And again, like if I were to try to summarize this in my own words, so basically Taylor is saying, look, people usually interpret Hobbes as an amoralist, doesn't believe in morality, says there's nothing in addition to self-interest, and people always behave in their self-interest, and there's no such thing as justice or injustice. Justice is simply what is conducive, like whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite, that which he calls good. And now suddenly in the Chive, Taylor finds a quote which says, no, a man who does justice only out of fear of punishment is not being properly just, right? Now, immediate objection could be, look, this is the Chiva, it's an early text, Hobbes has changed his mind. But that's a problem because we need to double check this, but as far as I remember, Hobbes actually issued a new publication, a new edition of all three works, the Chiva and Elements of Law and the Leviathan. Again, we need to double check this. Maybe I either remembers. I'm fairly certain I've seen this somewhere. I think I've seen this in Cambridge introduction, in the Cambridge introduction. So that what I mean to say is that to some extent it seems that Hobbes intended those texts to be read side by side, at least on some level, and not as one superseding the other. So the argument is there. And the idea in Kant in general, is that we can perform actions purely, or we can be motivated to perform certain actions according to Kant simply by our rationality. And Kant derives this categorical imperative, which I don't think we need to go into right now. And Taylor wants to say that there's a deep similarity between what Kant is saying and what Hobbes is saying, with an important difference is that for Kant, basically you have this universalizability criterion. Again, I'm not sure if it's meaningful to talk about this now. Maybe let's discuss this more in the seminar. Again, Kant is focusing on the so-called universalizability criterion of an action, for an action to be moral. Whereas Hobbes, when he talks about being rationally motivated to perform certain actions, he relies mostly on this issue of giving a promise. So sort of, if I have made a promise and then I do not keep it, it is a logical contradiction. Mm-hmm. And it's like, again, Taylor doesn't write these words, but just to explain this in my own words in a fairly primitive fashion, again, if I tell you, I promise that the exam is going to be next Wednesday, and then in the same sentence, I say, I promise that the exam is going to be next Wednesday, but the exam is not going to be next Wednesday, right? This is a logical contradiction. This is an inconsistency. What I've said is nonsense. And if you've heard me say this, right? So I promise that there's going to be an exam, but there won't be an exam, right? You can reasonably think that maybe I do not understand the words of English language, or maybe there's something wrong with my head. Maybe I am mad or irrational. Maybe I'm not in command of my speech, right? And this is more or less Taylor's assertion. And Hobbes does seem to sort of circle around this point, around this issue. And of course, one has, if we want to be pedantic, and Alan Ryan, when he talks about this in the Cambridge Companion to Hobbes, Alan Ryan does want to caution us that Hobbes is probably overstretching this idea, because people do this, of course, right? Like, let me go back to the example, right? If I say, I promise that there will be an exam next Wednesday, but there will not be an exam next Wednesday, but I have no intention of making the exam next Wednesday. If I say these words out loud, that's a contradiction. But if I say the first half and then only think the second half without saying it, this is not a logical contradiction. This is called lying, and people do this all the time. So like, but at the same time, so even though people do lie and do this all the time, Hobbes comes, as Alan Ryan says, Hobbes comes dangerously close, or like comes very close to saying that basically any kind of lying is a logical contradiction, and we have a rational ground to never lie. So again, I'm not sure how clear this is, but this is like the basic direction of the argument that Taylor is trying to make. And I think there are problems with this approach, and I think that indeed, as Boucher stresses, the chapter in Boucher stresses, that reading Leviathan as a single text is problematic, reading Leviathan, the Chiva, and the elements of law as a single text is even more problematic. So my preliminary resolution of this dilemma would be that, yeah, Hobbes is being slightly inconsistent. And the line of reasoning that I would take if I were to try to reconstruct or explain Hobbes is that actually Hobbes is committed to amoralism. And when he uses these phrases, he's just being somewhat inconsistent. But at the same time, we should be aware, again, this is Taylor Warrender thesis. This is Taylor Warrender thesis in front of us. And this is basically what Taylor is saying. And Taylor tries to focus on this precise issue of this sort of purely rational ground, purely rational motive for action. So action motivated not by desire, but motivated by pure reason. Again, if I have made a promise, my reason tells me that it is a logical contradiction to not keep the promise. So as long as I can keep the promise, I should try to keep it. I have this obligation. Again, this is reason imposing obligation, not passions imposing obligation. And in general, the outcome, the conclusion of Taylor Warrender thesis, especially of Taylor part here, is that similar to Gene Hampton, they would imagine that the state of nature is not as chaotic as some Hobbes' interpreters set it out to be. But again, there are like in addition to this mistrust and difference of passions, in addition to all of this, there's an important commonality that all people or almost all people have reason, and reason gives them motives to actually get out of the state of nature and to make promises and to keep promises. Hopefully, we'll talk about this more on Friday, and especially the difference between Kant and Hobbes and Taylor's interpretation. Let me again pause here. Any questions about Taylor, maybe at this point? Okay. So let me continue. So the last thing I want to look at in the remaining 15 minutes is Warrender. So oops, yeah. So this is Warrender, and Taylor is only 20 pages. Warrender is a fairly large book. So there's the whole book, and I'm not exactly sure how far we need to read the book itself, but definitely I think the last chapter, this appendix about other interpretations, which is actually less than 20 pages, I think this is something that we can take a look at. So this is starting with page 330. Yeah. So I think it's a good idea to take a look at all of the interpretations and basically, but we need to focus on Taylor, right? So the first thing that actually Warrender begins with is Oakeshott. So he also gives an Oakeshott's interpretation. So considerations of Hobbes' theory of obligation has usually been piecemeal or indirect, as detailed review of the work commentators upon the subject not been attempted. Anyway, so Oakeshott and Taylor. So I think he begins with Oakeshott. Yeah. And again, like per se, we don't need to look at that, but especially if you have time, if you want to again go beyond basic understanding, I think that Taylor, Warrender, and Hampton are more important, but still, it's a good idea to take a look at Oakeshott as well if you have time. And so we have a good summary of Oakeshott, I feel, here, starting on page 330. So he talks about Oakeshott, blah blah blah, and then on page 335. So let me add this to the chat. So this is Warrender. Page 335. He summarizes Taylor, and I also, as far as I remember, he gives a summary of the differences between himself and Taylor. So Taylor puts forward the view that Hobbes' ethical doctrine, disengaged from egoistic psychology, with which it has no logically necessary connection, is a very strict deontology. Again, deontology is a word that's used to describe Kant. So deon, so deontology is kind of an important word. Deon in Greek means duty. So deon, duty. So basically ethics of duty associated with Kant. So why do we use this word deontology? Why does Taylor and Warrender use this word deontology? Because sort of you can have this egoistic, say, emotivist psychology, which says that the only thing that can motivate people to action is emotion, right? And deontology says no. There's at least one other thing that can motivate people to action, and this is duty, their understanding of their rational duty. So this is why we use the word deontology here. Okay, let's go back to the text. So Taylor has put forward the view that Hobbes' ethical doctrine is incoherent. Yes. So Taylor puts the view that Hobbes is a deontologist. Fiercely suggestive, though with interesting differences, that some of the characteristic thesis of Kant, right? So that Hobbes is similar, although not identical to Kant. So in his illustration of this analogy, he points to Hobbes' distinction between the justice of actions and justice of persons, which he maintains to be precisely Kant's distinction between action done merely in accordance with the law and action done from the law, with the characteristic difference that Hobbes is trying to reduce the law from which the virtuous man acts to the single law that a promise, once duly made, must be kept. Taylor proceeds to assert that Hobbes goes so far as to anticipate Kant's attempt to reduce all really wrong-willing to the irrational attempt to will both sides of the contradiction at once. So again, to will both sides of the contradiction at once. The thought here is that at bottom, the same as Kant's, but for the difference that Hobbes reduces all injury to the violation of an express or implied promise, and that he has not, like Kant, thought of the universalizing of maxim as a criterion of its freedom from contradiction. But the important point is that Hobbes agrees with Kant on the imperative character of the moral law, as he also agrees with him on the assertion that this is the law of right reason. Anyway. Yeah. So this is a very important passage. And then Warrender continues. Since Professor Taylor has taken the view that Hobbes bases the duties of the citizens ultimately upon the fundamental natural law that implies obligations antecedently to and independently of the commands of the civil sovereign, the broad outline of his account resembles that which has been given in the present work. So again, so now Warrender says, look, Taylor looks like me, but there are differences. Let me talk about the differences. There are, however, a number of important points on which there's disagreement between whom? Between me, between Warrender and Taylor. It has been contended above that Taylor's analysis of the obligation in the state of nature in terms of reciprocity cannot be justified from Hobbes' text. It may be added that he overemphasizes the place of scripture in Hobbes' doctrine, the place of the Bible in Hobbes' doctrine, at the expense of the rational laws of nature. The Bible is a prophetic source of information regarding the will of God, unlike natural law, etc., etc. Hence, the declaration of what scripture are to be taken by the citizens as authentic is a matter which can be safely left in the hands of the sovereign. So the sovereign interprets the Bible, not the people. Taylor's treatment of sovereignty, moreover, like that of Professor Oakeshott, follows Hobbes' account of sovereignty by institution, but both commentators would appear to have ignored the Hobbes' case of sovereignty by conquest or acquisition. The greatest discrepancy, however, between Professor Taylor's interpretation and basically Warrender, right, arises from the attitude taken to what might be called the Kantian analogies in Hobbes' doctrine. In spite of the advocacy of Taylor and sometimes support from Tönnies, wonderful, Ferdinand Tönnies, we have regarded the drawing of analogies between theories of Hobbes' account as generally misleading. There are, it is true, some striking similarities, but they turn out to be superficial. Hobbes maintains that the law of nature may be known by the use of reason, and he also tries to show that breach of covenant is a variant of logical absurdity. So this is again, in some sense, this is Taylor's assertion that amoralism is reducible to a form of logical absurdity. To be amoral is to be irrational. To be amoral is to sin against reason, sin against rationality. But the obligatory character of the natural law is his doctrine. But the obligatory character of the natural law in his doctrine does not follow from its rational form. The laws of nature are theorems and do not oblige except in their capacity as commands of God. So this is the difference. This is the difference between Taylor and Warrender. Taylor wants to say that reason obliges, and Warrender says no, reason obliges only because these are laws that come from God. So Taylor, reason alone can oblige, and amoralism is a contradiction. And Warrender says, oh, laws of nature oblige only because they are God's commands. So this is a theological interpretation. Okay, let me go back to the text. So, whoops, yeah. So this is by the way, this is almost the end, right? Yeah. So I hope you can hear me. I hope the sound is fine. The rational nature. So the rational nature of the laws of nature guarantees not that they are obligatory, but that they are knowable without special promulgation as God's commands. So again, the fact that they're rational is simply that through our reason we know what God commands. We have found the essential function of the rationality to be reside in serving that purpose. The purpose of, again, knowability. That reason again, like for Taylor, reason obliges, but for Warrender, so for Taylor, reason itself obliges, but for Warrender, it merely informs us of God's will. And it's God's will obliges, not the laws of nature. And God's will obliges, not reason. Whoops. Yeah. Moreover, even if Hobbes' laws of nature were to be regarded as having intrinsic authority, it would still hold true that covenants oblige, not because covenant breaking is a form of self-contradiction. Again, you see, look at this phrase. Covenant breaking is a form of self-contradiction. For Taylor, covenant breaking is a form of self-contradiction. So for Taylor, covenant breaking is a form of self-contradiction. But because the keeping of covenants is a way of seeking peace and is derived from that principle. So Warrender says that even if we break it God, and if we focus on laws of nature are good because they lead to peace, not because it's a self-contradiction. Further, Professor Taylor takes the view that according to Hobbes, dutiful acts is one obedience to the law, for which obedience is a motive, blah, blah, blah. We have seen, however, that on law, Hobbes stipulates that the individual has a duty not only to perform, but also to intend to do so. He does not lay down the additional requirement that the individual shall act from the motive of reverence for the law. Apart from the fact that acting for the sake of law would raise problems for Hobbes' theory of motivation, we have noted that in his doctrine, the individual does not have a duty to be a just person, but only a duty to do just actions. For the justice of persons is not is a matter of God's grace. Similar reliance upon Kantian parallels leads Taylor into an exaggerated estimation of the importance of Hobbes' theory, principle of keeping promises, circumstances, which is discussed elsewhere. Anyway, so notice Taylor does not really talk about this here. But again, you will remember that Boucher stresses that for Warrender, Boucher, so talking about Warrender, Boucher stresses that for Warrender, laws of nature oblige and God obliges because of the fear of punishment after we die. And then Boucher discusses to what extent we can know, we can be aware of our estate after our death. Warrender does not talk about this here. So maybe, especially those of you who are doing presentations for Friday, maybe it's also a good idea to look in the text to try to find Warrender talking about these issues. So maybe we are talking, who knows, but kind of preliminarily it looks like, this chapter 8, obligation based upon salvation. I don't know. Maybe that's what Warrender is talking about. Maybe that's the main chapter. But that's, again, people, this is a collaboration. Maybe hopefully again I'm helping you and you help me, because I do not know Warrender inside and out. But we do have about a month to get to all those things. We have 2 minutes left, but let me do something interesting in the remaining 2 minutes. Let me actually open Cambridge Introduction, and let me so not Cambridge but Oxford Introduction. Let me open the Oxford Introduction, and let me talk about Macpherson. Yeah. So this is going to be page 30 of the Oxford Introduction. So this is Oxford Editor's Introduction. I wonder what's the name of the person. Whoops. Apologies. Hang on one second, please. Yes, it's Gaskin. And by the way, we can probably refer to that on the exam, because, and I've seen a reference to this somewhere, so I should add this file to Microsoft Teams. I should add it right now. And let me add this to the chat as well. Yeah. Okay. So and from Gaskin. So Gaskin, page 30 of the introduction. What we have is a quote on Macpherson. And again, like the basic idea of Macpherson, I've already talked about, so I'm not even sure if I want to explain this, but I just wanted to alert your attention that it's there. That's strange. Whoops, I've uploaded the wrong file. Okay, that happens. Okay, this is going to it's going to say, okay, I'll do this after we finish the lecture, because obviously made some mistakes. But I will post the quote right now. So this is again Gaskin, page 30. And again, the basic point of the quote is that Hobbes is not describing is not describing human conditions everywhere, human nature, but is like misinterpreting the peculiar circumstances of early capitalist society as universal conditions of human nature. So, and again, so I pasted this into the chat, and I'll actually, after we finish the lecture, I'm gonna correct the file that I have uploaded. Okay, people. So incidentally, I see that we have run out of time. So let me do the following. Let me thank everybody very much for your attention and participation. If you have to go, feel free to leave. Otherwise, if you want to ask any questions, I'm here for as long as we need. And otherwise, I will see you on Friday, and we will talk about presentations. So again, thank you very much, people. I will stop the recording now.